Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So, Elizabeth, it's a great pleasure and honour to have a chance to talk to Elizabeth Colson at the ASA Diamond Jubilee. Elizabeth, when were you born?
1917.
1917. And where was that?
It was in a small town in central Minnesota, a place called Hewitt. And when I was 2 months old, we moved to Wadena, about 10 miles away. And that's where the family continued to live until my mother moved out in around 1968.
68, right. Mm-hmm. So tell me something about your family, your parents.
My father's father came from Sweden in time to get into the Civil War on the northern side. That's how we got our name. He arrived as Carlson, but because there were so many Swedish men in the Minnesota regiment, the captain couldn't keep them straight. He had too many Carlsons and too many Andersons and so on. So he went down the lists and told them, for the duration of the war, your name is this. And my grandfather became Colson, liked it, so he had it changed after the war. My father's mother came from southern Germany, near Stuttgart, first to Wisconsin and then to southern Minnesota, where she met my grandfather. And they married there, and shortly after my father was born, they moved to central Minnesota, taking up land under the Civil War veterans preference, because in southern Minnesota the farming had been pretty much wiped out for the moment by the locust invasion. So my father grew up on a farm just about 10 miles from where I grew up. And my mother's family were old Americans out from New England and New York Dutch. They had moved to Ohio, and then, which is where my grandparents met, and then they married and moved on to southern Minnesota, where my mother was born. My father went to the University of Minnesota, and then began working. He became a superintendent of schools. And my mother went to Carleton College and then began to teach school and became the principal of the school where my father was superintendent, which is where they met. This was in Minnesota. And then my father decided on a school superintendent's salary he couldn't support a family. So he went into a bank, and then they married, and they lived in a number of small towns in Minnesota, and then Wadena, and all had 4 children. And I'm the second.
Did either of their personalities or interests particularly shape your life, do you think?
Oh, I think so. Both of them were interested in things, though my mother perhaps more read a great deal. She was interested in birds, flowers. My father loved poetry. Both of them encouraged us to do what we wanted to do. When I came down and announced one day that I was going to be an archaeologist, they said, okay. When I said I was going to the University of Minnesota, they said, that's your life. So they would back us. And we used to say that we never took anything in high school that somebody in the family couldn't help us with.
Right, your father.
Well, both my parents were in a great many things, and among the things my father did, he was, for quite a number of years, he was president of the school board. My mother, and also president of the library committee. My mother was head of the book committee of the library, and so on. So, as I say, they were very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Tell me something about your school. Were there any teachers or subjects that had a big influence on you?
One of my teachers was an English teacher. This was in high school. And although I wasn't very grateful at the time, I realized I should have been. She told me that I was going to write an extra essay every week. We were each supposed to write one, and I was to write two. So I did, and she did me the honor of reading two essays. We had some very good school teachers at that time in this small school in Minnesota. The town was about 2,000, but they managed to get good teachers in the public schools.
Was there any subject that you particularly took to? Or?
I liked history, I liked English. I cannot say I was fond of mathematics. Biology I liked. I did well in all of them, but that was because I could memorize.
Why did you decide to go on to university?
Well, I started out wanting to be, I think first of all I wanted to be an astronomer, then realized all the math involved. Then I wanted to be a naturalist, but I didn't like moths. And then somehow or other I got into some of the magazines that were coming to the house. I got interested in archaeology. And I knew that to be an archaeologist I had to go to the university, because that was the only place in Minnesota that taught archaeology. But it was assumed that we'd go to university or to college.
What did you read at university?
I read the Department of Anthropology, had archaeology, and what we now call social cultural. It was a very small department, but by the time I ended, I was more trained in social anthropology than archaeology. And I also learned that I would not be taken on digs. There was a summer program every year in which the men doing studying in archaeology were taken on digs, but a woman would not have been at that point. But by that time I was getting interested in other things. But my senior honors paper was on the Stone Ages of Africa, rather far away from what I did later on.
Were there any teachers there who...
Yes, the Wilson Wallace, who had been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford very early in the century. He had gone there planning to, I think, do classics, but a chance lecture, I think by Tyler, had attracted him into anthropology. So he did anthropology under Merritt and I think Balfour Buxton. Then went back and couldn't do a PhD in anthropology at Pennsylvania. So he did a PhD in philosophy, but used to go up to Columbia and sit in on seminars that Boaz was giving. And did field work with the Makah and later on with the Canadian Dakota. So he was very influential, and his wife too, Ruth Wallace. She was a physical anthropologist who had done a degree first at Radcliffe and then had gone on to do the PhD with Boaz at Columbia. And she was very interested in things like growth studies. And but after she married, this was during the Depression, she had to give up her job at one of the colleges in the Minneapolis area, because a married woman should not take a job away from men. But she kept an eye on me, and they both helped me very much along the way. So I did not only a BA there, but I also did an MA. And during that time, I was secretary in the department. It was a half-time job, and that's how I was able to afford it. And Wallace managed to get me a fellowship to go to a field school. The summer after I graduated, first of all, he had money from the Social Science Research Fund, and he sent me to Peabody Museum and Harvard to do abstracts, to read and do abstracts on a project he had on primitive science. So I spent the summer reading at Peabody, then came back and started graduate work, and also secretary in the department. And the following summer, he got me a fellowship to go to a field school, which was run out from New York University under Bert Aginski, who was there, and Ethel Leginsky, who was at Hunter. It was in California, a small town north of San Francisco, Ukiah, and we worked with the Pomo Indians on what was this was in 1939, and it was modeled on the sort of studies that were being done then in the States, though certainly not here, the study of a community. We looked at the Pomo. We were also supposed to look at other people in town, but most of us preferred to work with the Pomo. We found them more interesting. So my MA thesis was on Pomo women and acculturation. And I also, during those, and I went back, I did that first year, 39, went back and finished my MA at Minnesota, came back and did another summer with the field school, and then went to Radcliffe to start the PhD. And after I had 1 year there, came back to the third summer with the Pomo in the field school, then passed my generals at Radcliffe and went to Nia Bay to do my dissertation research among the Makah. So, but during those 3 summers, I collected the material for what turned into a publication called Life Histories of 3 Pomo Women, which eventually did get published.
I often quote the Pomo, the famous old Pomo saying, I think it is from Ajinsky, about reflecting on what has happened since the white men came. I don't know if you know that.
No, I don't.
Oh, well, I'll tell you later. The students find it very nice. So who you did your dissertation, your PhD at Radcliffe, did you?
Yes, and Clyde Cluckone was my advisor.
Okay, well, tell me something. Clyde's name has come up, and he was one of the people who brought me into anthropology through this book. So tell me something about him.
Well, you know, he also was a Rhodes Scholar.
Yes.
Clyde I think he'd started out at Princeton, and then it was either TB or a wonky heart, and he was sent to remote kin in New Mexico, in Navajo country, that which got him switched on to the Navajo. Then I think he went to Wisconsin. Ralph Linton was there at the time, I think. Then he went to Harvard. No, then he went from there as a Rhodes Scholar. And then he went to Harvard and did the PhD. Someplace along the lines, he also taught at New Mexico and had gone back to Harvard to teach, about 2 or 3 years before I went. I'm not sure he'd liked Oxford that much. He'd gone off while he was there and also studied in Vienna with Pater Schmidt. And so he had a respect for some of the German work in diffusionism. He was also interested in philosophical background, and he read probably more widely in what was being done in Britain than the others at Harvard. Indeed, at that time in the department, I would have said Cluckone was about the only one who, for me, was stimulating to work with. Most of the others were in archaeology or physical anthropology, or my Tazer, with whom I had to take courses. He was very proud of the fact that his course on social organization had not been changed since 1922, and anybody who'd ever taken the course would know not only on which day, but which minute in an hour to come in to hear a joke. That was very influential for me. I decided then and there that I would never develop course notes, and I never did.
You've always given lectures without notes?
No, I'd outline it on a card the day before with headings and so on, and perhaps a few quotations. But I could never go back and do the same one twice. I always had to redo it. So the course always had to be enough different so that I kept interested.
What was he like as a man? I've heard very
Tozzer?
good. Mm.
Well,
How
when
do you
I
spell his name?
Tozzer. He was a Mayanist. I believe he was probably quite a good Mayanist. But, and he did have some influential position on the board at Radcliffe. On the other hand, he certainly didn't encourage women. And when I arrived, he was at Radcliffe and went to the department to sign up for courses and so on. He looked at me and said, "Why did you come here? Why didn't you go to Chicago? Why didn't you go to Yale? Why did you have to come to Harvard?" Which was hardly welcoming. But he, there was a rule at Harvard at the time that women could not take any course at Harvard which was open to both undergraduate and graduate students. If you were a graduate student at Radcliffe, you could take courses at Harvard which were open only to graduate students. Well, some of the courses that you might want as background were open, and Cluckone allowed me to come in and sit down, said I could come in, take notes, take part in the discussion. The only thing was that it could never be on the record that I'd been there. I couldn't be shown as auditing. A friend of mine who was a contemporary felt that she should take a course being offered by Tozzer. And he told her, as many did at the time, "Fine, you can take it, but you'll sit outside the door in the corridor where you can hear and take notes, so you'll have the content, but you can't be in the class."
Amazing, amazing world. Tell me something about Cluckone. What sort of man was he as a teacher?
Most of the time he wasn't a good lecturer, but every now and then he was able to spark your mind, and you felt as though your mind were going into high. It was a wonderful feeling. You start thinking in a way that you usually didn't. So I would say in many ways he was a wonderful teacher. In the reading courses I took with him, he was very likely to come in and say, "Do you have anything to discuss?" And before you could draw a breath and say, "Yes, please," he'd say, "Good, then see me in 2 weeks' time." But when I went to do field work, he had me send back field notes, and he read them and gave me very detailed feedback. So, like all of us, mixed.
I gather he had a formidable wife, Florence.
Florence, yes. I knew her slightly. She was in sociology, and she was interesting to talk to, but I can't tell you much more.
Very organized, I heard. So, what was the thesis? It was about the Makah.
Makah. This was it's basically the same thing as the book, which is the Makah study of assimilation. I had got, initially I was interested in culture and personality. So this was partly, I think David Mandelbaum, who was at Minnesota, who was a student of Sapir at Yale, had been very interested in culture and personality. And I'd taken courses with him at Minnesota. Got interested in that, and then with the field school, Pullman Field School, I started to do life histories. We were each asked to do one our first summer, and I got interested in it and then pursued that for the next 2 summers. And so my proposal for the dissertation, I planned to go to the Makah Reservation and work with women in different generations, trying to see what was transmitted. And the relationships within the family. But I realized not too long after I got there that I wasn't adequately trained to work in culture and personality. And I got much more interested in what was going on. And so I concentrated on trying to get such records as information as I could on the earlier organization, and then what people were doing at the time I was there. It was an interesting time. I arrived, I think it was 2 months before Pearl Harbor. And almost immediately thereafter, since it was a town right at the edge of Cape Flattery, with a small port, in came construction workers to build camps for soldiers and so on, and in came soldiers and sailors and so on. Well, it was a very peculiar time in the life of the reservation. But I'd also been reading, of course, quite extensively in the acculturation literature. And that's when I also made up my mind that I didn't believe in such things as cultures. And acculturation was for the birds. But I could believe in people interacting, and I could believe in such things as assimilation. And I looked at that, the effect of being a people on a reservation with special social status and what it involved. And Clucone went along, by the way, when I switched.
Do you remember your first arrival on the reservation?
Yes.
Was it a shock or surprise? Or
Well, I got there, I guess it was October. I caught a bus from Seattle, I think to Port Angeles, and another bus from Port Angeles to the reservation. And the bus driver found me a place for the night with a customs officer who lived on the reservation, and his wife. They'd lived on the reservation for a long time. Then the next day I started out and I asked people I met on the street about a place to stay. And a woman said, "Oh yes, my daughter has a place." And so she led me over to her stepdaughters, and that's where I stayed. And this was the Makah woman.
Did you have any, you'd had the previous experience obviously of the Pomo
Yes.
work, so did you have any large sense of shock or culture shock or surprise, or was it all quite moderately familiar?
Do you know, I can't remember after all these years. I can remember it was cold. I can remember I was rather surprised watching the cows standing on the beach looking at the waves, or lying down in the road. But I can't remember. I do remember that the Pomo had been very repressed. They'd had terrible experiences, and they were very quiet except when they got drunk. And the Makah, on the other hand, were Northwest Coast people, and it was their reservation, and they didn't mind telling anybody that this was their place and who they were, and they regarded themselves as very important. That was a pleasure.
So you wrote the thesis. Who were the examiners?
Let's see, Clyde Clucone and, Donald, he was, at that time he was head of the Peabody Museum, and somebody else, but remember it was wartime.
Yes.
So I don't know that it was who it would have been on in any other time, but it was accepted. And incidentally, meantime, I'd passed my orals, which had to be in anthropology generally. But then when I went back to write my dissertation, then I did what were called specials. And my specials involved work in sociology and in psychology. So the committee for the specials included Talcott Parsons and a psychologist.
Did you get to know Talcott Parsons at all?
Yes, slightly then, but very much as a student. I sat in on one of his lecture courses, and he was on my exam. And then later, when I was at Manchester, he came for a term.
What was he like? His lecturing was supposed to be a bit boring.
In those days, I could take shorthand. So I took his lectures in shorthand. And it was interesting that they looked they went on forever, the sentence. But then you found that if you sorted it out with punctuation and footnotes, taking out the footnotes, it came out as a complete sentence at the bottom of the page. And what that particular course was on the American social system.
Yes.
And he was good. I think if he's kept off theory and done field work, done real ethnographic work, he would have done some very interesting work that have stood up.
So what happened after you got your PhD? Did you
Well, by that time I was working as Clecone's research assistant to earn my living. And there was a nice habit in Britain of advertising academic and other positions. And there was an advertisement for a job with the Rhodes Livingstone Institute, which appeared, I think, both in Man and in Africa. And I applied for the job. This would have probably been in 44, and heard nothing until I think it was about August of 45, maybe September. I got a cable from Max Gluckman saying, "Congratulations, you have the job." So I went home a little before Christmas, thinking I'd be leaving shortly for Northern Rhodesia, and nothing happened until finally I left on, I think, the 1st of April.
Why did you choose to do that? Because had you had much interest in Africa or
I'd had
East Africa?
I wanted to work someplace where people had not had as much being pulled in, as assimilated, as Native Americans. I wanted to be where they could be themselves in a way that I didn't think they were, the Native Americans could be. So I wanted to go someplace. I rather wanted to go to Borneo. But the Rhodes Livingstone job came up, and I had done Africa as one of the fields for my generals as part of my training. And I'd taken work on Africa with Walter Klein, who came to Minnesota my first year as a graduate student. And at that time, one of the things as secretary in the department, one of the jobs he gave me was transcribing material from the literature for different courses he was building up. While his course on Africa was pretty well built, I did some reading for him, though I did much more reading as he was building up a course on Japan, China, and Tibet.
So, did your arrival in Africa have a memory for you now?
Well, we went from Cape Town, we went from San Francisco on a cargo ship to Cape Town by way of Cape Horn, which impressed me. It took 30 days. We didn't see anything except flying fish and albatross, things like that, for about 30 days. Max Gluckman met me at the boat, along with, I think, John Barnes and Clyde Mitchell. And they'd just finished the training for and had written up the Lamba report, and then had come back down to Cape Town. John and Clyde had both been appointed at the same time I was. They'd come down to Cape Town for a special course that Max had arranged that we should have before we started our regular work in Northern Rhodesia. Neither Barnes nor Mitchell, of course, had anything more than a BA because they'd been involved in the war. And whereas I'd spent most of the war years, but not quite all, in working for my degree. So we had this course. Gluckman had come down on leave and had a cottage at Musenberg with Mary and John, who was about 3. And I stayed with them for a couple of months, and then moved into the hotel when they left. And then we started out, I went to stay with Monica Wilson at Fort Hare. I then went to the Transkei, looked around the Impondo, and then went up to Johannesburg where Clyde and John joined me. And we were shown around different places in Johannesburg. All this to get us aware of what we were likely to see in northern Rhodesia, especially since Max thought that what was happening in northern Rhodesia was heading in the way of South Africa with industrialization and so on. And I think I met my first a man from Baratziland in one of the gold mines, about 6,000 foot left. So.
You mentioned so many interesting people. Perhaps I can just pause on one or two of them before we move on. Monica Wilson, who I met once. Did you get to know her well?
I spent that 2 or 3 days with her, maybe 4. I don't know that I saw her again until she came to Northwestern in 63, 64 to give a lecture. And then she came to the center at Stanford, late 60s, early 70s. So, and in 78, when I was in Cape Town for a month, I went over and stayed with her.
She seemed a very nice person when I met her.
She was. Very thoughtful, widely read, very interested in botany. She was developing that wonderful garden, which she was going to give to South Africa. But she said she wouldn't give it under the present regime because she was sure that the European government would just close it to Africans and allow Europeans only. And she wanted it for all South Africans. If we could go back to Minnesota for a moment. One of the things, at that time, of course, it was possible to read quite widely in a way that you can't now with so much, when there's so much available. But we were encouraged to read in sociology, especially in what was then a very active field of rural sociology, which in many ways was doing some of the things that later on became part of anthropology in its study of small rural communities in the United States. I suppose this had been spurred on by the Depression and all that was happening then. And so I did get not only some training in anthropology at Minnesota, but was encouraged to have more interests than just anthropology. Again, after I finished my Makah fieldwork, I didn't go back to Radcliffe immediately and start writing the dissertation. Cluckone got me a job under Alex Layton in the War Relocation Authority. That was the organization that was in charge of the Japanese who were moved away from the West Coast in the United States. And we were in a camp in Arizona. It was called Poston. Layton was head of what was called the Bureau for Sociological Research. He was a psychiatrist who had trained under Adolf Meyer at Hopkins, but had sat in on the famous Gardner-Linton seminar at Columbia, which is where he met Cluckone. And then Layton had gone and worked among the Navajo and also among the Aleut. The other person under him was Edward Spicer. And Spicer had been a student of Radcliffe Brown's at Chicago. Spicer encouraged me to read a lot of things that linked up to the Radcliffe Brown School, including the Newburyport studies by William Floyd Warner, which were just coming out. And also at that time, Hortense Powdermaker had just written her Deep South. And there were other studies of contemporary American communities. But so I got a dose of social anthropology before I hit Britain. And for the way Spicer presented things, it seemed to me to give a much better framework for moving in, doing field work and starting to understand what was going on around you than I'd had, and from people who had been trying to push starting from the idea of culture or culture and personality. So when I came to Northern Rhodesia, I already had some familiarity, and that's why Max and I got along so well. But also at Harvard, I came in contact with some things which probably the British weren't aware of, because they had been involved with the war, and it was there in American universities because we had so many many refugees from Germany. But I got introduced to the writings of Kurt Lewin on social dynamics, Moreno on the social drama, and on the sociograms. And all of those things interested me very much. And I combined thinking about that with my thinking about the social anthropology of Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski. And at the time, I much preferred Radcliffe Brown to Malinowski because Malinowski at that point was talking about culture, and Radcliffe Brown was talking about societies. And societies for me meant people, and at least you could see people. And cultures, I had found out with Makah, were a mishmash and always had been. So when I arrived in Cape Town, one of the first things Max asked me about was my views of Malinowski. And I, thinking no doubt he's a Malinowskiite, was being very cautious in my reply. But I did indicate that I rather found it difficult to understand concepts of culture, and Malinowski's book on acculturation, culture change. Whereupon Max thought that I really knew my stuff. And we got along fine ever after.
Well, tell me, since he's figured large already and will do, tell me something more about his personality and influence on you. What sort of man was he?
He was tall, energetic, more energy than most people ever have. I came to think that he had so much energy that he exhausted all the oxygen in the air around him. He could be incredibly generous. He would take an idea that you or a student or somebody had and think about it and polish it all up and develop it and then hand it back to you and say, that was and then tell people that was their idea. That was enormous generosity. And he worked very hard to improve anything anybody asked him to look at. On the other hand, he could be overwhelming.
Authoritarian, or?
I suspect so. On the other hand, if you said to him, Max, think like an anthropologist, he'd back off and stop ranting.
And what about the other pair you mentioned, John Barnes?
Barnes was had come out from England. No, he had retired. He'd come out of the Army as a lieutenant commander. Had been in the Navy. And he had trained in anthropology before the war and expected to go to Harvard on a fellowship, but instead went into the Navy. He was interested in mathematics, better analytical models. And he spent the war in reading a lot of the journals, because in the Navy, he'd been in Hawaii and elsewhere, and he was able to tap into the literature. Oh, in many ways, he was much more aware of what had been coming out in America, and that had been influenced by the German scholarship. He knew about the work on the sociodynamics and so on. Clyde Mitchell had spent the war as, I think, in the South African Air Force as a navigator. And he too was mathematically minded. He and John bonded, both because of their war experience and I think because they had some of the same way of thinking about things. I always thought that John was more imaginative of the two, but others thought that Clyde had a real streak of being able to see a theoretical point and develop it.
And you got on with both of them very well.
Well, yes and no. When Max got the appointment to Oxford in '47, he had me appointed as acting director of the Rhodes Livingstone Institute. We then had about a year of field work. After all, I had the PhD and they didn't. And I'd had a good deal of field experience and writing up. I wouldn't say that endeared me to John or Clyde or to Hans Holleman, who was also appointed, but I was working in southern Rhodesia, nor probably to Max Marwick, who was a colonial fellow, but his grant was being administered by the Institute.
So there was jealousy.
I couldn't say whether it was jealousy or not, but I know they rather sent me to
somewhere else.
Yes. We, on the boat going to England, see, at the end of our first year of field work, under our contract, we were supposed to come out and start writing up so that we had a very good idea of what we needed to do in the second year of field work. But right at the time we should have come out in '47, Northern Rhodesia was beginning to restaff its administration and technical services. And the government reneged on its promise to provide housing for us. So Max, who was just resigning as director, persuaded the board of trustees to send us to Oxford with him as a place to find housing for us and a place to write up. Well, Hans Holleman decided no, he didn't want to go to England. So he went to Cape Town and worked with Shapira. But Barnes and Mitchell and I went to Oxford. And on the boat going over, they barely spoke to me.
Oh.
They probably don't remember, but I do. However, it went away, and we certainly worked well together. We were in good terms.
What about Audrey Richards? Did you meet her there?
I didn't meet her then. I met her during '47, '48 when I came to Britain. She had already left Johannesburg and returned to Britain by the time I got to Africa. So I met her probably when I went up to the LSE seminar, or it may have been at the first meeting that I went to of the ASA, or it could have been in at the JRAI. But I did meet her, and later I went to stay with her in 1950. When I was on my way home. I took the flying boat from Livingstone to Entebbe. Audrey had recently come out to the East African Institute, which she was building, and I spent a week with her, and she took me around Uganda. And then I saw her, I went, I think it was '57. She came back and did about 4 months of work in Bemba country. And I went up and spent a week with her there in Bemba country. And then I saw her when I came to Britain after that. We quite often saw each other. So we were good friends.
Would you say she was a good field worker?
I would say so. She had a wonderful ability as a mimic, as you probably know. And she could keep people amused. And I gather that she had the Bemba still remembered her with affection, had tales about her when she went back in 57. She had the seeing eye and the broad base of concerns from which to work when she was a field worker. I remember her telling me about an American psychologist who'd come out to East Africa. And they had gone to Aganda village, homestead or something, where the psychologist had set up some interviews. And they got there, and of course, the person he was going to interview on his chosen sample wasn't there. And so he was terribly taken aback and couldn't do anything. Whereas Audrey sat down and talked to everybody and got a great deal of information.
So you arrived in Oxford in 1947?
Yes, I wasn't formally attached, but they allowed me to sit in at the Institute and take part in everything that was going on there.
And who were the people?
There was Evans Pritchard, who'd recently become the chair. He'd recruited first Meyer Fortis, who was the reader, and Max had arrived about a month or so before we had, and he was senior lecturer. Then EP would bring in various people to give special lectures. Meinhardt came and spoke on gave some lectures on East Africa. Peristiani, I think, also did, and Franz Steiner was doing some on social organization.
Well, EP was obviously a huge figure and influence on many of us. What was he like as a person, as you remember him?
Rather quiet, very witty. In seminars he rarely spoke, but if he did, it was always to the point. Very highly respected by Fortis and Gluckman. He was working, I think he just finished the Sanusi book. He was working on the Nuer religion. By that time he'd become a Catholic, but it didn't seem to dominate things that much. There were a number of students who had followed him over from Cambridge, and it was quite clear that he was the kind of person who really attracted students and held them. There was Emrys Peters, Ian Cunnison. I didn't meet Kathleen Goff because she and her then husband were in southern India. I didn't meet Godfrey Leonhardt because he was off among the Dinka that year. But, oh yes, there was Julian Pitt Rivers. Paul Sterling was very new, just finished a first in greats. Mary Tu Douglas was there. Laura and Paul Bohannon from the States.
A glittering group.
Yes, it was. And Barnes and Mitchell and myself, we went up to London every week and sat in on the big joint seminar of Firth and Ford. So there I also would have saw Nadell, Leach, Richards, Mayer. Let's see, who else was sitting in that seminar then, senior level? Little.
Well, are there any of those panoply who you became close to or would like to say anything about?
Lucy Mayer and I became very good friends and maintained it in later years. And I used to see her every time I came to Britain. She was, again, she could be very witty. She was a wonderful person to walk around London with because she understood it. She loved it. And she could talk about the buildings. On the other hand, sometimes her opinion of her fellows were interesting but acerbic.
Yes, I've heard some of them.
And also at Oxford that year, she had nothing to do with the Institute. Was certainly not regarded as a social anthropologist. was Beatrice Blackwood,
Ah, yes.
who
She was in the museum.
she was at the museum. She'd done that work both sides of Buka Passage, and then she'd done all that work in New Guinea, but hadn't written it up because with the war on, she became the mainstay of the Pitt Rivers Museum and did other things. But so.
Did you? I mean, the legends of the drinking and the going to the whatever the pub was at that time and so on.
Well, the institute at that time was they shared some space with the geography building. Didn't feel that it had enough space, so it was trying to persuade the university that it needed more. But the pub where everybody went at the end of the big seminar, I think it was on Friday, was the King's Arms. And everybody went there.
Everyone went there.
Yeah.
So did you teach at all at Oxford? Or
No. Let's see, we were asked to give some presentations of our material, and I did. I think the paper I did for them, one of them, was, I think Max suggested it. We each did one on the modern political system, which later came out in what used to be Bantu Studies and became African Studies. So I did that for Oxford, and I also did a paper that I presented at the RAI that year. And then each of us also wrote up a sort of general sketch. And these were the papers which were eventually published in 7 Tribes in British Central Africa.
You edited that, didn't you?
Max and I did, yeah. And again, Max's generosity, he said I should be senior editor.
That's very nice. So what happened at the end of Oxford?
I went back, and by that time the trustees had confirmed me as director. I was no longer acting director. So I was director of the Institute and also continuing to do field work among the Plateau Tonga. When Max left, the house that he had had as director was taken over by the administration, by the government, to be used for one of the incoming civil servants. So there was no housing for me in Livingstone. And I said, fine, since there's no housing, I will direct the Institute from my tent. And I did. I would go down, fortunately for this arrangement, where I was working was very close to the railway line. It was probably mostly about 10 miles from a place where I could catch a train. And so I would work in my tent. The mail would be delivered. I'd answer such letters as I could. And periodically I'd go down to Livingstone and make sure the accounts were in order and order books. And what editing I didn't do on the journal and the papers I did there. And then I'd go up to Lusaka for the trustees meeting. But on the whole, I much preferred it, working that way, than trying to live as a single American woman in Livingstone all the time.
What were you studying?
Max had gotten the money out of the Colonial Development and Welfare Fund for the expansion of the Rhodes Livingstone Institute, our appointments, under a research plan which stressed that we were going to be looking at the impact of what would now be called modernization. That is, labor migration, cash cropping, or other involvement in the market economy. I had come, when I got on the ship in San Francisco, I thought I was going to go to the Luapula. But when I got to Cape Town, Max told me I was going to the Plateau Tonga. The then district commissioner on the Luapula said his was a very awkward district to run, being on an international boundary, with criminals hopping back and forth across the border, and he didn't think he could cope with a woman too. Whereas the Tonga were on the railway line with no international boundary, and they couldn't make that excuse. I don't think the district commissioner wanted an anthropologist. But when we sent him a man, he couldn't make the objection to him that he'd made to me.
Audrey talks about the fact that being a woman in some ways was a help, actually, in her field work.
It was. I remember after one of our conferences, John Barnes came to stay with me, and people liked him. But when he went away, they said to me, "No, he's going to have a very hard time." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Oh, because he's a man, and they'll think he's administration." I said, "Don't you worry about me?" "Oh, yes, but you're a woman and you don't have that clout. You can't do as much damage to us."
Yes, that's...
So, and as a woman, I could talk with the women and children, and women of all ages and children. I could talk with the senior men. I was careful not to talk with the young men except in a group. And whereas I think the men had some difficulty in talking to the same range of females, and they may not have had any more success talking with the men who may have had, been worried about whether or not they might be
government officers.
Yes.
So how long were you there?
And, well, let's see, I started work among the Plateau Tonga in, I guess it was September 1946, left to go to England in September of 47, came back in June of 48, and then I left to go on leave, I think it was late August of 1950. So all in all, it was a little more than 3 years. But of course, I was also doing work for the Institute, which pulled me out now and then.
You've been back a number of times.
Yes, but I've never spent any long period of time with the Plateau Tonga since. Because when I went back in 56, it was to the Gwembi Tonga, who were living down on the Zambezi River, about 4,000 feet below the plateau. And I've continued to go back to the Gwembi Tonga for fairly long periods of time over the years.
How many times have you been back there, roughly?
Oh, goodness. Well, I shared that project with Thayer Scudder. We were both there in 56, 57 for a year. I went back for 2 weeks in 60 on a special project. We both went back in 62, 63 for a year. I was back for about 6 weeks, 2 months, 65. Very briefly, 68. I was there in, I think it was 6 months in 72, 6 months in 73, a few days in 78, 9 months in 82, 83. I spent a year in Zambia in 87 as a volunteer at the university. So I went to see people, but I didn't spend any long period of time down in Gwembi. Then I went back in 92 for 6 months, I think. In 96 for 4, 98 for 2, 2001, I guess it was 3. And since then I've been going back to Zambia, but just going to the villages for a day.
Must be one of the longest revisited.
It is, though the one that George Foster, Mickey Foster, had in Tzintzuntzin in Mexico is even longer.
Is it? Well, how do you deal with the huge accumulation of
We
material?
started to try and computerize the demographic and some of the other quantifiable, easily quantifiable material. We started doing that in, I guess it was 68. And then one of these lovely things with technology, we were doing it down at Caltech. And Caltech decided to replace its computer without paying any attention to the fact that it would completely outmode the possibility of our using all this stuff that we'd coded. When we started recoding, I think around 92, and so, and then we coded it for a young man who was in demography and was going to work with it. And then I think about having spent 3 years and doing a lot of coding because we didn't think we should turn it over to students who were likely to make more errors than we did because they weren't as interested in the material. Then we discovered that nobody any longer was using the software system that he had had us use to code it. And while he had the mathematical skills to write special programs that would allow him to get around this, for most purposes that material was no longer available.
That's a very sad but common story,
Yes.
I'm afraid.
Mhm.
We've endured that as well. But presumably all your original field notes and materials are...
I've given them to the Bancroft Library, which is the research library at the University of California, Berkeley. And it's there with a stipulation that no one shall have access to it without my permission, or I think Ted Scudder's permission, before the year 2030. This is because field notes contain so much unexpurgated gossip.
Yes. So we got really towards the end of your time as director of the Rhodes Livingstone
Yes.
Institute. What happened then?
Well, I went on leave expecting to go back for another 4 years as director. Max had gotten me I had a full year's leave because I delayed taking leave. And Max had arranged for me to have a Simon Fellowship at Manchester. And as that was drawing to a close, I realized that I really didn't have the energy that I needed to go back to Northern Rhodesia and move the Institute to Lusaka, build a whole new site and everything. I'd gotten the grant for the move and the building of the new institute. Turned out I was badly anemic, but at any rate he offered me the job of senior lecturer, so I stayed on at Manchester. And that first year, I think, when I was a Simon Fellow, didn't seem to make much difference whether you were a fellow or actually on the staff. I think Ronnie Frankenberg was already there, very young. Freddie Bailey, and I think Bill Newell, and maybe, yeah, Bill Newell. And then we had made new appointments to the Institute before I resigned. And that was Vic Turner and William Watson and Jout van Velsen. And the understanding was that they should come and do a term or two at Manchester to get trained specifically on doing field work in Central Africa before they went out to start. So we had those three. And they went out, they did field work, and then they came back later. Scarlett Epstein was a student. Bill Epstein came back from doing his colonial fellowship on which he did the study of law in Northern Rhodesia, and then entered on the program to do a PhD in Manchester.
And there's another glittering array of names.
And then Max could bring in people for a term or so. So he brought George Homans, the sociologist. John Barnes came as a Simon Fellow for a year. Clyde Mitchell came as a Simon Fellow for a year. No, I think for a term. Talcott Parsons came for a term. So we had lots of visitors. There weren't many staff. Oh yes, when Cunnison finished his field work, he came, and then he, I think, was appointed as lecturer. He was there doing his dissertation writing up his dissertation on the Luapula people. So,
Are there any of those many people, because we can't pursue them all, but any that you would particularly like to comment on or got to know particularly well?
well, F.G. Freddie Bailey, with whom I'm still in touch, and whose work in India, and then all the work that he's been doing since then on analyzing political interaction, I've always found very interesting. I've said I'm still in touch with John Barnes.
Yes. So it was a very lively place, Manchester, at that time.
Yes, it was. And
did you take part in those going back to Max's home and going to the football matches?
I never went to a football match, but I did go to some of the work parties.
The work parties?
Yes.
Cleaning up his garden and things like this. So what were you teaching at Manchester?
I don't remember. I think I gave one seminar on Plains Indians. Max was one of the people here who really did have a good training in ethnography and was interested in ethnographic material from around the world. He'd been properly trained by Mrs. Hernley in South Africa, whereas most of the people here knew their own area, ethnographic area, but they weren't widely read outside that. They read in other fields, but Max had both of them. So that's why probably we did this thing on Plains Indians. I probably ran a seminar when people were presenting their field materials. Remember, we had practically no students at any one time. And also everybody sat in on other things. We sat in on at least one or two seminars or things in economics, because Eli Devons was very interested in what the anthropologists were doing. We sat in on stuff in government. There was the professor of government was very interested in what we were doing. We sat in on Dorothy Emmett's class that Dorothy Emmett organized for us. There was Werner Stark, who was talking on German sociology, and also he also was in that he brought in the Scottish Enlightenment people. So it wasn't narrowly confined to anthropology. We were encouraged to explore right and left.
Fascinating. So how long did you stay there?
Let's see, I came back as Simon Fellow in January of 51, and I left at the end of, in December of 53, and went back to the States.
Why did you leave?
I decided I'd better make a decision if I were going to go back to the States, I should go then. It would become harder and harder. At Manchester, Max was such a dominant force that I realized that it would be difficult to develop on outside his stream. I could have gone elsewhere. EP asked me to put in for a job at Oxford, and Raymond asked me to put in for a job at London, at LSE. But I couldn't have done either, because that would have been seen as base treachery, and it just wasn't feasible. So I got a job back in the States, and at that time, the only chance of a job was at a women's college. But very shortly afterwards, the African Studies Center opened at Boston University, and I was one of the few people then in the United States, anthropologists, who had a good deal of training on Africa, and I got a job there. But
and then you taught for how long in America?
I taught. The rest of my life of teaching was in America.
So it's about another 20 years? Or
Well,
more?
let's see. I went back. I started at Goucher in, I guess, January of 54. Moved to Boston, fall of '55. Then I had a job at Brandeis, a year at Northwestern, then went to Berkeley, and I had 20 years at Berkeley. But of course I was doing went off for field work and things in between, during some of those years.
Were there any colleagues, particularly in Berkeley, who you got to know very well and influenced your work?
I shared courses with quite a number of people. I remember doing a seminar on law together with Laura Nader, doing a seminar on cults that Gene Hamill had organized, and he asked me to sit in on. David Mandelbaum and I shared a lecture course on religion once, but the people I taught with most consistently were Burton Benedict and William Schack. They were both students at LSE, and we organized a seminar on, which came to be called British Social Anthropology, though quite a few of the people we talked about were not British. But that became the first term of a course required of all incoming graduate students in social cultural anthropology. And we tried to teach it as based on using basic readings and to show people what happened when you started from the point of view of a society. And the second term was taught largely using American materials and emphasizing the use of culture and the way in which that could take you. So I suppose Burton and Schack and I co-taught that 7 or 8 times. Then Benedict was teaching a seminar on in which students were presenting their dissertation research. And Schack and I both sat in on that consistently. So we shared a great deal.
Both in your teaching and in your interests, and the fact that you've been in the 2 areas of anthropology in Britain and America, you must have reflected a lot on the differences between the 2 traditions. Have you any idea or theories as to why the British tended to stress society and the Americans' culture? Or
well, for the Americans there were 2 things. One, of course, was that Boas and his students were grounded in the German tradition, with all the emphasis on culture stemming out from Herder, Hegel, so on. Whereas the British school was much more influenced by French, the Durkheim, Mauss, and also by Van Gennep. So there was that difference. But then the Americans, so many of them were immigrants or children of immigrants. And they saw life as one in which you changed your culture and you became something. Whereas for the British, it was much more, didn't matter. There was this ordered society in which you were who you were, and they were much more conscious of status. So I think that played a rather strong part in influencing the direction that they both went. When I got to Britain in '47, I was surprised to discover that while the people here had been reading Durkheim and, as I said, Mauss and Van Gennep, they hadn't been reading Max Weber. I never heard them ever refer to Zimmel, and they hadn't read Pareto, all of which were part of my graduate training. They read a different literature.
So just another one or 2 general questions, if I may. You mentioned, I think in your talk last night, that many anthropologists go for a short period to a place and they tend to do a cross-sectional study. So So I was just wondering if you had any reflections on the relations between anthropology and history and the need for longer periods of anthropological fieldwork.
The difference is, and the quality is quite evident, although people like EP could do magnificent things based on about 9 months' work.
Mm.
So I suppose, and for some things, it doesn't make that much difference. But EP, of course, did have a history background, and probably was thinking of it in a longer perspective. But you couldn't, at one time I collected information on the anthropologists of up to about 1970, I think it was, seeing at what period they did their field work and where they did it and how long it was. And it was amazing how few of them had done any field work over the age of 40. And I began to realize that what we had was the ethnography collected by young people. And when they went back into their field notes, of course, they went back into their youth. So some of what's going on in ethnography is the recollection of youth being relived. Whereas you can't quite do that in a long-term thing. It keeps catching up with you and you're old.
Just going back into your youth, is it also, it's often been said that anthropology is rather romantic and sometimes claimed to be escapist, in that people are trying to get away from the fragmentations of the West and the individualism and the hyper-rationality, and so they seek out holistic and enchanted worlds, which...
Oh, well, yes, I think that may have been true at one time, though I'm told that at Berkeley now, when a young woman said she wanted to go off and work on the borders of Bolivia and I think Peru, she was told, well, that's not what an anthropologist does. You should be going into a factory or into a lab. That's where anthropologists work. So whether a lab or a factory is an escape hatch, I don't know. On the other hand, how many people do you think would go into anthropology, would have gone into anthropology in the past, if they hadn't been dissatisfied with themselves?
All their lives around them, yes. Another question I want to ask is, of your life, you must have seen the paradigms in anthropology shift hugely. And it's often said that now, having gone through the structuralist, Marxist paradigms, we're now in a post-paradigm age where there's nothing that unites or underpins anthropology.
When you get this many people in a profession, there's never going to be a paradigm again that unites us, is my suspicion. So they're doing a great many different things. If you're doing different things, you have to adopt different methods, and you probably adopt different theoretical approaches. So I don't think, despite the fact that if you check bibliographies, you're going to find inevitably that everybody's mentioning Apadurai. They're not mentioning Geertz quite as much as they used to. Rabineau has come in, so on. I've been fascinated during this meeting. Not a soul has mentioned Foucault, Derrida, or I think Bourdieu. But everybody is mentioning Kant. Have you noticed how often they've referred to Kant?
Yes, Kant is very
So they've certainly gone back to a very ancient paradigm. Yes. So Kant and Hegel are in. They're not, as far as I can see, certainly not at this conference, playing up the importance of any current figure, British, German, or Russian. They obviously can't read Chinese, so we haven't gotten into Chinese yet. Probably in about 10 years' time.
Yes, we'll have lots of Chinese. Right. Well, was there anything that I've left out that I should have asked you, Elizabeth? Would have been interesting, you'd like to reflect on?
Well, if you were asking me about my own work,
yes,
I would say that one of the things about it is that been a bit of this and a bit of that. I tend to work on something that I find interesting, finish it or do what I can, and then try and explore something else. But then I always like learning.
So you've moved, just elaborate the sort of things, your trajectory.
Well, for instance, I started out in life histories,
Yes.
and I do have the Pomo life histories. I did that work on assimilation. Then I was working in the structural functionalist line in the early years in with the Plateau Tonga. Then I started to switch over to looking at the importance of movement, and I initiated work on migration among the students at Berkeley well before I will own joined the department, and indeed had to fight to get it accepted as a possible field that graduate students could submit. And I argued that it should be a theoretical field. Everybody else was talking about people as though they sat still, and most of the world was in motion. So I've worked on the impact, and I've worked a good deal on the impact of large-scale technology upon the people who are in its way. Spent a year.
What kind of technology? You mean?
Big dams.
Dams, I was going to say.
Spent some time with the Refugee Studies program. My most recent articles, not published necessarily. It's wrong to get articles for festschrifts and other things, but one is on AIDS of the moral order in Gwembe, so I'm looking at something quite different again. And the other is an article on studying in the methodology of studying refugees.
Many, many subjects. You've been very prolific and written a great deal, 15 books or more. Have you any advice if a graduate student or someone was watching this, and have you any advice on writing or? Yes,
never until you're established agree to write for a volume of essays which is going to come out. They may come out 10 years later, it may come out 20 years later, and that's not going to do your career any good, especially since the article which you wrote 10, 15, 20 years ago will seem so outdated to yourself.
And actually, how do you write? I mean, do you write on a typewriter?
I used to write on a typewriter, now I use the computer.
And any special time of day or length of time, or do you just whenever you feel like it?
Whenever I can get myself to sit down and do it. There, like many people, I fight it to the last moment.
You don't enjoy writing?
I think I do after I get into it, but it's difficult to somehow or other get oneself into it.
Fine. So is there anything else I should?
I think that's it.
Thank you very much indeed,
Right.
Elizabeth.
Well, thank you.
Years ago, when I was young, school children were made to memorize quantities of poetry. Some of it stuck, especially bad poetry. The celebration of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the association brought back to consciousness one such verse, and I propose to inflict it upon you. Here goes. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Now, by definition, founders are great men and women. But I was cynical enough to suspect that what they had said and written might well have been obliterated as the windiness of 60 years of academic discourse, which incidentally has included a fair amount of hot air, shifted the sands on which they may have left their mark. It is a common complaint among senior anthropologists that nobody reads them anymore. Indeed, one of my Berkeley colleagues recently told me, no one is important for more than about 20 years. Who now pays attention to the people we thought important in the 1950s and 1960s? So I did some research, or rather, had a citation check made by Suzanne Calpestri. the epitome of the research librarian that every anthropologist ought to have at hand. I gave her the names of 10 founders and asked her to check for citations from the list from the 1st of January 2005. Amazingly, all 10 of them are still being cited, although the majority have been dead these 30 years or more. What they wrote is still an active part of the intellectual heritage of anthropology. But more of that later. One important footprint they undoubtedly left. That is the association itself, even though it has grown out of all knowledge and no longer provides a forum for a small number of people who know each other well and read each other's work. 10 people met in July 1946 to discuss the desirability of an association devoted specifically to the furtherance of the interests of social anthropology, and incidentally, social anthropologists as well. Some months later, a committee drew up a list of other potential members, 9 of whom, according to David Mills, were based on Great Britain, while another 15 to 20 were scattered around the Commonwealth. They all held postgraduate degrees in anthropology, overwhelmingly from LSE. 15 years later, in 1961, the association had grown to include 142 members. And here I am relying on an article by the Ardners. By 1990, by my own count, it had 500 members, whose advanced degrees were taken at some 55 different universities, including some outside the Commonwealth. The first meeting I attended was held in London in late 1947 or early 1948, a little over a year after the original gathering. I think every member of the association who was then in Great Britain came, which meant there were about 15 of us in the room. We fitted easily around a table. I don't remember if anyone gave a paper, but the discussion was collegial and combative. Even then, not everyone spoke up. As a young anthropologist, newly admitted to the August body, and very impressed by the eminence of everyone else, I kept silent. But as a compulsive note-taker, I recorded what others said. Unfortunately, these field notes have disappeared over the years. After all, I never expected to write them up. I do remember referring to the occasion as the meeting of the for down the side of the notebook alternated the names of Firth, Ford, Fortis, and Fortune, with occasional interpolations from Gluckman, Nadell, Richards, and Mayer, and even rarer comments by Christiani, Leach, and Little. The last two seem regarded as neophytes. Evans Pritchard was characteristically, expressively silent. In some respects, those who came to London, as well as the absent members, were a cosmopolitan group. They had crossed disciplinary and territorial boundaries in becoming anthropologists. I doubt that any of them started out to be one. After all, before World War II, anthropology was rarely taught as an undergraduate degree in Britain or I think elsewhere in the Commonwealth. They came out of history, law, geography, psychology, economics, biology, and engineering. As anthropologists later, they were also prepared to borrow quite freely from other fields whenever they felt it was advisable. Those born in Great Britain were in the minority. The remainder of the first group, of perhaps 30 members, had been born in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and India, with parents, some of whom had never visited Great Britain, while Nadell came from Austria and Christiani from Cyprus. Oddly enough, that first group contained no Canadians, which suggests that Canadians of that period who became anthropologists looked to the United States. All had traveled outside their home country, and all, at least for a time, lived in Great Britain. They were familiar with cities strung around the globe. Their field research had taken them to different ethnographic regions, to Africa, North America, Asia, and the Pacific. I think none had worked in Europe or South America. Anthropological investigation of cities and peasant communities may already have been envisaged and had already been undertaken by Robert Redfield at Tepoztlan, Hortense Powdermaker in the deep south of the United States, and W. Lloyd Warner and his team in the study of Newburyport, Massachusetts. but it was not yet practiced by the social anthropologists of Britain. Money available to them for field research was largely to finance research elsewhere in the Commonwealth, on the colonized rather than the colonizers. Beside their cosmopolitan transcending of boundaries, they had another thing in common. All except myself, Radcliffe Brown, and Brenda Sailor-Brown had sat as students in Malinowski's seminar, and at least the latter two had known Malinowski. Subsequently, Malinowski's students may have revolted against him, but they still bore his mark. Whatever else they had read, and in comparison with their American contemporaries, most of them had read very little ethnography. They had all read Malinowski on the programs. Their seminars would be modeled on Malinowski's seminar, just as was their ethnography in its reliance on particularism, that it involved a search for how activities are interrelated and justified in what later came to be called cognitive models. Along with Malinowski, they assumed thinking actors who might be working from assumptions about reality that could be challenged, but they were nevertheless behaving rationally given these assumptions. The association could be described as a dissent group as well as a guild. Its members recognized this and were quick to differentiate between themselves and others who might claim to be anthropologists. Cosmopolitan sympathies were extended only so far. They had little good to say of American anthropology, except that carried out by Chicago students of Radcliffe Brown. And they were especially dismissive of work labeled culture and personality. They were adamant that various British anthropologists, who were not of the Malinowskian elite, were unworthy of the name, even though they might hold teaching positions in Britain itself. And their ethnographic publications, at least to the outsider, compared well with those admitted to the canon. He or she is not a social anthropologist, with the damning words that consign such persons to an inferior status. While criteria for membership was much discussed in the early years, it was difficult to be certain what they were or how they applied. Having a degree and holding a job in Britain or elsewhere in the Commonwealth were said to be essential, but did not guarantee acceptability. Publication cannot have counted, or I wouldn't have been admitted when I was. My degree was from an American university, and I had never laid eyes on Malinowski. But I did have a job in Northern Rhodesia, so I fell within the Commonwealth. The selection process was influenced by ecological considerations as much as by a desire to maintain an unsullied line of descent. The goods for which anthropologists competed, jobs and research funds, were limited and determined by conditions not of the anthropologist's making. There were, I think at that time, 4 professorships in all of Britain, and there were perhaps 3 or 4 more scattered throughout the Commonwealth. There was an expectation that resources would be more abundant now that the war was over, and the Colonial Development and Welfare Fund seemed ready to help finance research institutes and independent fellowships. Those returning to civilian life in 1945, or being released from various government agencies as the war ended, looked upon this as a chance to obtain jobs and research funds for themselves and their future students. In such situations, people are likely to operate on what George Foster has called a principle of limited good. And so they tried to limit the number of those who might compete with them for scarce goods. The social anthropologists of the 1940s were well aware of how easily disciplinary boundaries could be crossed, and the likelihood that those with little or no formal training in the discipline would be regarded as anthropologists. Some of the few academic posts for anthropologists in Britain were held by people who had learned their anthropology in the job, as colonial administrators and missionaries, and a further cadre of such people existed, members in good standing of the Royal Anthropological Institute, who might be given consideration as academic posts became available. This gave impetus to the call for a professional association limited to those trained in anthropology in the only schools they saw as capable of providing such training, that of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. The year before, similar concerns, incidentally, had led to the reorganization of the American Anthropological Association into a two-tiered body of fellows and members, with only fellows entitled to be regarded as fully qualified professional anthropologists. About a decade later, in the 1950s, in Britain and elsewhere in the Commonwealth, academic jobs and research funding increased substantially for a few years, providing funds for the founding of new departments, a large increase in the number of academic jobs, and rather abundant funding for fieldwork. And the inevitable happened. Those interested in anthropology were encouraged to regard it as a viable professional choice, and emerged as well-trained professionals looking for jobs and other funding in a less expansive universe, subject to the competition of those in other fields. The concern with competition has waxed and waned over the years of the association, and probably again resonates strongly among association members in 2006, especially now that boundary jumping is again the order of the day. Everyone is an expert on culture, and sometimes all the world seems to claim to do ethnography. One of the expected benefits referred to by Paul Silito when he urged the adoption of measures aimed at increasing the professional status of anthropology is, and I quote, the prevention of the poorly qualified passing themselves off as anthropologists. Now, I'm not sure that all of them want to be regarded as anthropologists. Many seem quite happy to be geographers, demographers, historians, political scientists, or workers in public health, education, policy studies, development studies, crisis management, or cultural studies. It might be more to the point if they could be prevented from passing themselves off as competent ethnographers. That is, if they aren't. Some are doing very good ethnographic studies and tread firmly in our footprints and our ground. If the people in these fields speak our language and do equally good ethnography, we may need to think again about our own claims on what it is that makes us distinctive. So we need to think afresh. Now, members of the new association agreed in 1947 that it was important to create a specialized professional identity for social anthropologists that differentiated them from the many who were interested in anthropology. They were less in agreement about what that identity entailed and about what work was appropriate for social anthropologists. They shared the old liberal dream that truth is ascertainable, and that when truth is made known, right action follows. Now, this, of course, assumes that the system is run by people of goodwill in the interest of an ascertainable public good. It's assuming a lot. Others urge the exclusive claims of teaching and basic research that would advance the theory and disciplinary practices. Now, here, too, we have a continuity for arguments about the appropriate use of anthropological skills. These have continued through the years. Today, probably more anthropologists hold positions outside academia than in, working as practicing anthropologists or applied anthropologists. And, of course, even those in academic positions do not necessarily sneer at the chance to work as a consultant. The association periodically tells us we must go out and make ourselves useful so that we will be valued by the general public and earn our keep. At the same time, status within the profession may well go to those who turn their attention to specialized esoteric subjects and write for fellow anthropologists, or even for a restricted number of like-minded spirits. Probably we will continue to differ, and the centenary meeting of the association will find its members arguing about what makes an anthropologist, as well as what it is that anthropologists should be doing. The theoretical issues that informed discussion during the early meetings of the association have proved less lasting. They are no longer divisive, nor do they interest many of us. Some of them, of course, no longer interest us because they were explored so comprehensively in the 1940s and 1950s that there's nothing new to be said about them, and further research simply confirms what is already known. Thus it was with kinship studies, until technological developments made people rethink assumptions about what constitutes kinship. They then found new and interesting questions to pursue, where the answers were not already boringly blatant. Theoretical continuities between the 1940s and the present are to be found less in the theoretical questions that guide anthropological interests than in the persistence of theoretical battles within the profession, thereby producing a dialectic through which any momentary agreement gives rise to new divisions. In 1947, I found members claiming to disagree about what should constitute the subject matter of social anthropology and appropriate modes of analysis. They formed factions attributed to doctrinal differences, though who belonged to what faction might be in dispute. The major rift at the time could be said to reflect both geography and allegiance to a leader, for it pitted Oxford and LSE against each other, with the structural functionalism of Radcliffe Brown dominating the former, and the functionalism of Malinowski the latter. Geographical outliers at Cambridge or University College sided with one or the other, or, if neutral, were likely to be claimed by both. That rift, of course, was soon to be superseded by others and more numerous rifts, as former allies drifted apart and found their own schools, whose students happily entered the fray and insisted on ever widening the disagreements. The Manchester Department came into being in 1950, and soon after there was a Manchester School. Cambridge was one for social anthropology, with the appointment of Meyer Fortis to the chair, I think about 1951, and Cambridge quickly acquired its own dogmas and ideas of superiority. And so it went. In such ways does the field of anthropology and the history of the association epitomize anthropological theory and illustrate how demographic and geographical factors affect human affairs. For what is factionalism but the playing out of fission and fusion in group formation and disintegration, the latter hindered and delayed by the existence of cross-cutting ties between the contenders. In 1947, however, people claimed doctrinal issues as the basis for their opposition. It was battles over the rival merits of structural functionalism and functionalism that enlivened ASA gatherings and sparked a determination to know what rivals might be up to that could be used to undercut their position or suborn their supporters. From time to time it was muttered, "So-and-so is really one of us," suggesting that the person agreed to the rival doctrine only for tactical reasons associated with jobs and future advancement, while being at heart a follower of the true faith. Or the practicality of subversion was canvassed. In fact, as in so many factional studies, in 1947 it was often difficult for an outsider to see why people felt so strongly about what seemed to be minor disagreements. I fell into disgrace by saying that as someone trained in the United States, I couldn't see why they argued so vehemently and sometimes so intolerantly when they worked in much the same fashion and spoke much the same disciplinary language. For that matter, they were so few in number, they couldn't have developed distinct dialects at that point. In those days, before jet travel became available or international conferences frequent, if they wanted to speak to anyone, they had to speak to each other. And for the moment, they were particularly loquacious because they had been separated during 5 years of war and were starved for anthropological talk. The more disputes, the better. And I should have recognized that difference is all. Divisiveness, therefore, has been an endemic element of the association's nature since its beginning. But then, division is a prerequisite of human social organization, and anthropologists are humans, despite being anthropologists. What is surprising is how often they ignore this, and seem surprised to discover that what they posit about the nature of social relationships applies to how they themselves interact with their fellows or others they encounter. In 1947, division did not preclude fellowship. It may now, given the size of the association, so that many now meet as unknown strangers. Originally, the members of the association formed a single, small, face-to-face gossiping community, even if some of them might be stationed in the Antipodes. They could count on other members of the association reading what they wrote. This is something present members may envy, until they may remember that this meant only about 30 readers. They met together in a single room, and afterwards foregathered in a single pub. In another context, Max Gluckman once criticized the city planners responsible for the laying out of a new town because they had provided only one pub, whereas anyone with a sense of social dynamics knew that a community needed at least two. Now here he ignored anthropological history, as the gathering in one pub long continued to be the hallmark of the discipline, and was lauded for its furtherance of lively discussion, communal solidarity, and a symbolic link to that primal London pub, where those attending Malinowski's seminar in the 1920s and 1930s adjourned. There, social anthropology might be said to have been born amidst the arguments of those who were then postgraduate students. The divisions and rivalries of 1947 have long since become history, vaguely remembered by only a few. They happened well before most of the present members of the ASA were born. So what about the intellectual contribution of the founders? If you are dismissive of their work, you may feel no compunction. They were equally dismissive of their predecessors. By 1947, paradigms had shifted, and none of them claimed Rivers, Hatton, or Merritt as ancestors. For the most part, they despised what they had written, or grudgingly acknowledged the merit of an article or two, while pointing out how these had been surpassed. Even Malinowski was said by some who have lacked understanding of social structure, and to be wrong about some other matters. Those who planned this conference on cosmopolitanism and anthropology have suggested that anthropological training is conducive to the cosmopolitan virtues that transcend, in their quote, the parochialism or ethnicisms of the nation state, and thus are prone to give empathetic consideration to so-called others. Now, we may be able to do that in some circumstances, but I would argue that we find it difficult to extend any such empathetic consideration to our own immediate forebears whose work is there to be transcended. We measure our advance by their shortcomings. Writing styles change. Reflexively, too, we project into the past what we take for granted about our own era. This is one of the problems, incidentally, with hindsight. What happened, having led to the present, becomes the inevitable outcome of the past, while what once seemed possible alternatives become inauthentic. It is no wonder if each generation of anthropologists sees the work of earlier generations slantwise and finds it difficult to understand why they paid attention to what, after all, now seem minor matters, cited what now seemed obvious, and seemed oblivious to what now would be foregrounded. Current members of the association may quite rightly think of themselves as far removed from the anthropology of the 1940s. They ask different questions, conceptualize their subject matter differently, and work in situations where their forerunners did not. Even the seniors among you are of another generation, and your interests, for the most part, are very different from those which preoccupied the men and women who founded the association. After all, you matured in a different world. Though you may sometimes cite them, you find it difficult to read what they wrote knowledgeably, because their vocabulary is now old-fashioned, and because you lack context, they took so much for granted that they did not realize they needed to supply them. In time, your own failure to provide such context, because you assume your readers know the background against which you write, will come back to haunt you when that background disappears. The truth is that those who founded the association had experienced a very specific world, which molded what they took for granted and what they challenged. They concentrated on what seemed important in their own time and place. Their research methods were also of the period. So let me try to give a context to their work. All the founders, save Radcliffe Brown and Brenda Seligman, were students in the years between World War I and World War II. They began field work in the late 1920s or in the 1930s, and they usually went where no other anthropologist had set foot before, which in a way is a rather enviable thing, although it does have its drawbacks. Given the transportation available at the time, once arrived, they were usually confined to an area that could be covered by foot, bicycle, or canoe. In consequence, they concentrated on the people who lived in the small region immediately surrounding them. And what they knew about local links to the other areas were usually based on what local people told them. They didn't have the facilities to follow in their travels, nor were they usually able to follow them over time. For when access to a place meant travel by ship, then rail, then truck, and then foot, once arrived, you stayed put until you left. And once you left, you did not expect to return. One result was that the fieldwork experience for them was probably more intense than it can ever be today. Friends did not fly in from all over the world to pay a visit. Probably nobody within miles was a native speaker of your own language. Weekends in town were out of the question. You had no wireless or phone, and even the arrival of mail was occasional and could not be counted upon. You and those you were working among were also unlikely to be bothered by frequent visits from officialdom or missionaries or NGOs. Perforce, you immersed yourself in what was happening locally and rarely came up for air. This had its repercussions on what field workers looked at. If kinship loomed large in their subsequent publications, this is because on the scale at which they were able to work, much of what happened was organized through kinship relationships, where they were regarded as biological or fictional. So while theoretical issues do guide field workers, in practice, feasibility dictates what they can do, as does the luck of the draw. That is the sheer serendipity of happening to be there when something happens. Those engaged in ethnographic research in the 1930s were certainly aware of the impact of colonial governments and international markets, but the conditions of the time made the rest of the world seem remote and not immediately important on a day-to-day basis. Much of the social anthropology written in the late 1940s, and remember this is all, most of it's based on work done in the 1930s, lacks the global context that we would expect to find today. Historical context may also have been lacking, although by the 1930s some studies of social change had begun to appear. This too is a feature of the time in which their field work was carried out. In the first place, as students of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, they were in revolt against the conjectural history of the previous evolutionary and diffusionist anthropology. They were also empiricists. Social anthropology, they thought, should deal with the contemporary, with what they could see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears. Their time span, therefore, was as limited as their spatial span. The one-time field visit was the order of the day. Long-term research with repeated visits, now so taken for granted, was a thing of the future. Isaac Shapira being a notable exception here. They usually had no way to check on whether what they observed was representative of other times, except from what people told them about the past. And they were leery of such accounts because it was accepted knowledge that myths and other tales of the past are social charters that validate present institutions and hierarchies. They were lucky if any previous visitor to the area or any local person had published an account against which they could measure their own findings. Archives were scattered, and access might be closed or given only on stipulations that made it wiser to avoid them. Written histories of a country or region were rare. Historians weren't interested in working where they worked. Historians arrived along with sociologists, political scientists, and economists only in the 1950s and 1960s, when living conditions were more nearly approached those they were accustomed to at home. So then also in the 1950s and 60s, scholarly work by local historians and social scientists began to become common as students emerge from the newly founded national universities. The lack of global and historical context in much of what was being written when the association was founded now seems glaringly apparent in a period when we take for granted that our field notes can be supplemented by newspaper and wireless reports, and by an abundance of documentation supplied by those in other disciplines, and that we ourselves pay repeated visits, and that between the visits, the post, the telephone, and the internet keep us in touch with those we have worked among. Often enough, we look over the shoulders of ethnographers who describe the area in the earlier decades. Whether we like it or not, currently it is hard not to walk in others' footprints, determining the history of their own time, and they gave primacy to such factors in pursuing their own research agendas. With the exception of Radcliffe Brown and Brenda Seligman, they had grown up in the years after World War I, a war that put paid to 19th century illusions about progress and European rationality. All of them had experienced the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the economic collapse beggared many, brought on massive unemployment, and put in question the viability of economic systems based on the market. As field workers in the late 1920s and 1930s, they found themselves among people who relied upon land or water to supply the majority of their needs. Now, when markets crash, as they did in the 1930s, those who can support themselves off the land are arguably better off than those who have come to depend upon a market economy that betrays them. A certain wariness of technological and economic innovation was therefore characteristic of this generation of anthropologists, as incidentally, it was of many colonial officials who had no desire to see the people they administered become as poverty-stricken and traumatized as those in their home country who were dependent upon the dollar. The rise of fascism, The rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s also left them suspicious of the superiority of political and economic systems that provided the seedbeds from which these emerged. Several had left European homelands when they became at risk as Hitler rose to power, and others had lived with the knowledge that their lives might well be forfeit if Britain was successfully invaded. The superiority of Western values and Western institutions was not nearly as taken for granted as it was in later prosperous decades, when technological advances seemed to promise the end of drudgery and poverty, and there was glib talk of modernization and the end of poverty throughout the world. In the 1930s and the 1940s, some of them saw communism as a viable and relatively benign alternative to Nazism or the capitalism which had devastated Western economies. But I don't think that in 1947, any of them wanted to live under such a system. Socialism was more congenial, especially in the terms preached by the British Fabians and the then Labour Party, newly come to power. In 1946, they had just emerged from World War II, which had dominated their lives for 5 years. Some had been on the battle lines. Others were survivors of the London Blitz. Their students in 1946, for some years thereafter, were mostly war veterans. Rationing was still on, and the food search was a constant reminder of the basic importance of provisioning in determining both what people do and what they think about. All were undergoing something of an identity crisis as they shifted from familiar wartime roles and statuses. When they turned again to writing up their neglected field notes, usually stemming from the late 1930s, they had much on their minds that influenced how they analyzed what they had recorded. If they preferred people as they had found them, it was because they were not at all certain that those who promised them a better future if they changed could deliver on such promises. Instead, they were likely to respect the political economy's ritual orders and dogmatic beliefs they described as viable, alternative systems of order. That is, ideal models of alternative reality, and unfortunately, from which much of the contention caused by perceptions of inequality and other evils were eliminated. This left them open to charges of sentimentality and antiquarianism, or even worse, paternalism, especially some decades later, when newly independent countries wrenched themselves away from colonial domination, but chose to adopt institutions which they saw as having led to the empowerment of Europeans. But if the 1930s had left those who founded the association, and many others of their period, skeptical of the long-term viability of European institutions, the superiority of European values, or any innate superiority of Europeans or those of European descent. That skepticism, I suspect, is shared by many of you at the present time who have new reasons to worry about what the Western trajectory is, where the Western trajectory is heading. Again, whatever their ethnic background, their intellectual stance was one of resistance to creeds that preached racial inferiority or justified the subordination of others on racial grounds. The South Africans among them were particularly vehement in this respect. Now you may say yes, but they accepted and served colonialism. And this is true, but only up to a point. They may not have demanded that Britain immediately dismantle its colonial empire, but think for a moment. In the 1930s, that would have meant that other colonial powers would have moved in to take over. They thought some colonial regimes better than others, and I think they were probably right. They saw their own role as one of providing a body of knowledge that could be used to inform and reform colonial policy in general, and the way administrative and technical officers worked at the local level. Colonial governments certainly did not regard them as reliable upholders of the system. Rather, they were seen as critics of the colonial order, under suspicion as possible agents of subversion, especially since their fraternization with local people did not conform to colonial etiquette and might give people ideas. There's certain irony in this, since local people were likely to suspect them of spying for the colonial government. But then suspicion of the field worker goes with the role. While working on the Makah reservation in 1941-42, I was suspected of being a German spy. In northern Rhodesia during the colonial regime, the administration watched to see if I were preaching subversive communism, while local people thought I was an oddball member of the administration, but less dangerous because I was a woman. In independent Zambia, suspicion continued, but in a new guise. Any American anthropologist is undoubtedly a potential worker for the CIA. So anthropological curiosity is rarely seen as an adequate explanation for the presence of persistent questioning of someone alien to the system. So you may say you have solved such problems by carrying out your ethnography at home rather than in places where you would be alien. And so you have obliterated the dichotomy between the us and the other that mars the work of your predecessors. That, of course, subverts the idea that anthropology is cosmopolitan in approach and tries to transcend boundaries to reach an empathetic understanding of others. It's also based on a false assumption that home is a homogenized place where people think and act the same way and share the same traditions, whereas it's likely to be a meeting place of many communities who relate to each other in different ways. Assumptions of homogeneity came to be seen as one of the distorting weaknesses of the social anthropology of the 1940s, when attention shifted to the roles played by conflicting constructs, situational choices, and competing power interests. But even if one could assume homogeneity, returning home does not solve for the anthropologists the problems of alienation caused by the dichotomy between the us and the other. Built into the very nature of anthropology is the necessity for comparison, if only to celebrate the unique. And comparison always raises the possibility of alternative standards. It requires one to stand off and look, especially at the familiar, as something that requires explanation and needs justification, as one more alternative human arrangement. One questions what others see as natural and right, the guarantors of their own self-worth and superiority. We do this to foreground it for study. The alien who cannot be expected to do, who needs instruction, may be seen as less subversive than the one who should understand and accept the basic premises by which people live. So long as our goals include contributing to the ethnographic record that makes comparison possible and inevitable, we share with our predecessors, wherever we work, this quality of being other. Now, you may have noticed that throughout this talk, I've spoken as an old-fashioned social anthropologist, and I have held to the anthropological dictum that one must stand off and critique whatever it is one looks at, including one's own society. But one does so in order to acquire a deeper understanding. Though my ethnography may be faulty, since it relies on undocumented memory, I've tried to do something with anthropological analysis of the association and its members at its inception. The association was founded by people of a given time who had learned to question their own society because they had so often found it wanting. Their ethnographic work may deal with other people, but it contributed to what, after all, has been the primary role of anthropology, the recording of the spectrum of human ingenuity that in turn foregrounds the familiar world at home and so opens it to informed thought. In doing this, anthropologists, of course, are encroached upon the realm of social philosophers, moralists, religious thinkers, and other social critics. Their anthropology has influenced Western thought and taught others to think in terms they introduced. It directed attention to the narrowness of vision of economists, sociologists, psychologists, and humanitarians who unthinkingly adopted Western yardsticks and assumed the givenness of Western categories. One has only to read and listen to catch echoes of what they said and wrote in the common parlance of scholarship and popular culture. This has been absorbed into the culture of the cosmopolitan, globalized world of the 21st century. Those who founded the association left an organization which continues to be divisive, I hope, and productive of new thought. They left an ethnographic tradition built on respect for others. Some other things remain to you, including the way your own thought has been molded by their impact on Western civilization and the times that have formed you.